The thing that many people know about my work is a diagram that looks a bit like this, the variations on it. And what I did was took C.P. Snow's idea of the two cultures, arts and sciences, and suggested that actually it's worth looking at four cultures, because I added in magic and religion to make a fourfold diagram. And a lot of my ideas stem from that. But one of the things that people find particularly intriguing is the tendency for to go round this diagram. Yes, to sort of cycle round the diagram. Now, and then people will say, where are we on the cycle now? But I never really intended this to be a predictive thing, because it's not like, say, the phases of the moon, which are based on a simple, basic mechanical model of what happens. So you can make exact predictions when things will happen. It's rather that when you have, anytime you have a sort of big balance to one particular culture, it tends eventually to lead to a reaction and a shift to another culture. And this can happen on so many different timescales. The shortest one, I think, is I've talked about recently, is when you have a little newborn baby. It begins its life really being a scientist. It picks up solid objects like spoons and examines them, feels how solid they are. It beats the table with it and it begins to make repeatable experiments. He discovers that things are solid, they have permanence, it's there the next day, and they do predictable things like push it to the edge of the table and it falls down. And so that's a sort of proto-science. But when it comes to more mysterious things that are not quite so predictable, like the behavior of mother, the behavior of the dog, the behavior of the weather, and why some plants grow better than others, that sort of thing, I suggest that the baby is imagining maybe there are minds out there, not just inside my own head. If mother has a mind, if the dog has a mind, I can't predict it exactly, but I begin to understand its behavior. And that really is the foundation stone of magical thinking for me. And it goes hand in hand with when babies are learning to speak, to communicate. And so it's not any sort of mechanical process, it's just that one thing leads on to the other. And that, to me, is what seems to take us around these cycles. But the most interesting one, in many ways, is the generational cycle, because most people have lived through at least one phase of that. And this is, it's sort of, it's like it's about 15, 17 years, something like that, you get a change. You see, my generation was brought up in the 50s, and the predominant idea of the time was logical positivism, which is such a sort of rational, materialist, skeptical frame of mind that it really makes someone like Richard Dawkins sound like a fortune teller. It was very strictly rational, and yet it was my generation that towards the end of the 60s became the hippie generation and a huge magical revival. So, and after that, the magical revival, there was a period from the late 70s, which I would consider, and through the 80s, which I would consider to be artistic. And then there was the decade of evangelism in the 90s, a religious phase. And then, at the beginning of this century, we had Richard Dawkins and the skeptical movement. And then, I know, about 2012, 2015 or something, we had that faded away and we had a huge magical revival again. And that's what we are experiencing still, and I'm enjoying it. So people say, yes, so what happens next? Well, according to the pattern, it will be a return to what I call artistic culture. Now, what does that mean? Well, maybe artistic isn't quite the right word, but it's got a lot of art in it. If we look back to the last time this happened, which was, the 80s, but we go back a stage further to the 1920s, after the fin de siècle occult revival. It had been interrupted by a world war in between, but the 20s really was a time of style and glamour and dance crazes and things like that. Flappers, the Charleston, and things like that. Now, it was a very active artistic time. You had all the new movements. You had surrealism, Dadaism, you had futurism, expressionism. So certainly it fits the idea of an artistic time, as well as at the popular level being about dancing and style and looking good. But to me, a more interesting thing was that it marked the beginning of a totally new art form. You see, at the beginning of that period, cinema, well, it was moving pictures, a bit of technological gee whiz, oh, look, the picture seems to be moving, gosh, wow. But by the end of that period, it was a serious new art form. Masterpieces began to be made, and cinema was born as a great art form. Now, in the late 70s, 80s, in Words Made Flesh, I suggested that the new art form would be computer graphics and computer gaming. Because at the beginning of that period, it was just, crude, pixelated graphics and, oh, look, it bounces off the edge of the screen just like a real ball. Oh, excitement, But I predicted that time would come when, with really beautiful graphics, we would have computer games with real sort of emotional content that really drew you in, where actually it taught you things, the experience of it. And I think to some extent that has happened. It is a serious art form, computer games, and graphics have just moved ahead incredibly. So that's two elements I would look for: style and new and artistic creativity and new art forms. But there's also another side of it which I'm not so happy about, because I suppose each culture has got its shadow, but the shadow of the artistic culture is greed. Art on the outside is all about beauty, transformation, taking people through to the next step and all that sort of thing. It's inspiring. But it has this shadow side, which is greed. I remember a friend took me to see the Frieze Art Fair in London, which is in a big central London park where they put up huge marquees, and for a few days there were these pictures on display and being sold, a great art market. And the pictures are not priced in thousands, they're priced in millions. And a friend who took me there, I said to him, ho, ho, if I'd won the lottery, I could buy that picture for 2.7 million. And he said, no, you wouldn't. They wouldn't sell it to you. Why not? 2.7 million is 2.7 million. He said, no. The art world depends on seriously rich people. A picture, if an artist sells a picture to someone who just happens to have the right amount of money in his pocket, that's nothing. They want to sell to the big collectors, the Saatchi and Saatchi, the Guggenheimers, the big art galleries and things like that have got billions to sell. That gives them status. What makes them into great artists. And I thought, that's a bit tacky, isn't it? The sort of sheer demonstration of greed and sheer one-upmanship and contempt for people who weren't in that class was shocking to me. Actually, there's a funny aside there, because I did actually buy a picture at the Frieze Art Fair, because there was a little stall at the end which said something like an original masterpiece for £10. And what it was is a group of artists were taking pictures out of glossy magazines and putting graffiti on it and selling them for £10. And I bought one which was obviously from a very upmarket business magazine, because it was all about forget the Ferrari. What you need is a business jet, your own business jet, to really impress your clients. And this glossy advert, and what they'd written on it in so many words was sort of, why don't you take a bus, you poor fuck, you know? So that I thought that was rather great. So I did come away with my masterpiece from the Frieze Art Gallery. Anyway, that's an aside. Now the point is that really this the element of behind all the style and everything, there's an element of greed and showing off. You know, you have to have the logo on the outside of your T-shirt to show that you spent a lot of money on it, and so on and so forth. And that is an aspect that I'm not particularly looking forward to. And the other thing, which is even worse in my mind, is the rebellion against the standards of, in my case, it was the hippie generation. My generation was very much got into caring for nature, caring for the world, for Gaia, you know, being vegetarian. I didn't go the whole hog myself, but, you know, it included things like being vegetarian, recycling waste, not being wasteful, not leaving mess around, you know, tidying up and that sort of thing. All those standards. Now, when the punk movement just began, I know it moved on and evolved beyond that, but right at the beginning, just as the hippies rather hypocritically had said, "Oh man, we're not playing music to make money. No, it's a spiritual journey for us," all that type of thing. You know, the punks said, "No, we want money. That's what we're working for," and they made a big thing of that. They were brazen about it, but they also called the whole hippie ethos of looking after nature and all that boring old farts. You know, "Oh, don't lecture us, you boring old farts. You know, we're going to do what we're going to do." And the Beatles went, for my generation, they sang "Can't Buy You Love," money can't do anything, money can't buy you love. And for the punk generation, they sang "The best things in life are free, you can give that to the birds and bees, I want money is what I want." So there was that sort of transition. And I see the signs of that ahead of us in quite a big way. Both the huge publicity-grabbing headlines about billionaires and what billionaires are doing and how billionaires are showing off to each other, and what are they called? Oligarchs, you know, with their fortunes and their yachts and things like that. See all those signs coming. Plus, although I think that the general public is still into caring for the world, still into recycling, trying not to use plastic too much, and they're signing up for solar panels and things like that to save the environment. Actually, the influencers who are making the big noise at present are swinging towards the messages of greed, disregard for the environment, disregard for Mother Nature, and that's a future I'm not looking forward to. So you might say, well, where's it going to take us? Well, if you think about those previous artistic phases, the one in Victorian times, which ended with a crash in the housing market and everyone went to religion. At the 20s and 30s, it ended with the Great Depression and the rise, in this case the religions were fascism and communism. And then in the 80s, it ended with a financial crash and the ushered in the decade of evangelism. suggests to me that what lies ahead, if we go down that path, will be a crash, and it might well be an environmental crash, like a serious rise in the sea levels or serious climate changes. And I may not be alive then. So on that sad note, I'm going to end this video.